Welcome to The Conversation, a podcast about educational technology, the learning sciences, and instructional design. This week we're talking about universal design and my love-hate relationship with it. But before we get to that, I would like to welcome my two guests, Kelly and Candice. Welcome, and please tell us a bit about yourselves.
Well, I'm Kelly. I'm studying to be a middle school biology teacher. I currently substitute, and I love it. I have a lot of fun. I was born in Flushing, Queens, and I moved out to Long Island as a teenager. And yeah.
Welcome, Kelly. Nice to talk to you. What about you, Candice?
This is my third master's degree. I teach 7th and 8th grade orchestra. I graduated from Hofstra University for undergrad and master's, and I just recently graduated from SUNY Old Westbury with a master's in liberal arts. I've been on Long Island my whole life. And just a little bonus conversation, I have 2 daughters and a husband who also teaches music on Long Island.
Nice to meet you, Candice. Welcome. So as I said earlier, our topic this week is on universal design, and I thought we could start with a question that Marina wanted us to address, which was, what is the difference between differentiated instruction and universal design, or UDL? So I think that's a great question. So why don't we start with that first?
So they are pretty similar. So I would say that UDL is more backed by research, where differentiated instruction doesn't have maybe the flexibility of UDL. Because I noticed the term flexibility was like the common theme of this reading. So I would say like differentiated instruction doesn't have the flexibility, or is not as backed by research and doesn't foster the whole brain as much as UDL.
Judging it based on my experience, I think UDL is more of a professional research topic that not necessarily has been tested and proven with an everyday situation, whereas in doing an instruction in your class, you have to be on your toes. Sometimes kids are having problems with a certain concept, but different in another subject area. So you're constantly on your toes trying to figure out concepts and ways to get at the students and help them versus just the research part of it. I think there's some sort of breakdown between the theories and practice that we haven't been able to be concrete.
I saw a really interesting analogy comparing the two because a lot of people have asked a similar question. And I thought this one analogy might be helpful. And this was a dinner party analogy. So the writer was saying that differentiated instruction is more like you trying to create individualized meal plans for your guests. So if you have a guest who likes paleo, you would create a paleo dish. If you have a dinner guest who is a vegetarian, then you would create a vegetarian dish, and so on. Whereas UDL is more like a buffet. So you would offer a lot of these different options that your guests would pick for themselves, and they will pick the best ones that meet their requirements. And I thought that was an interesting way of comparing the two, because there are a lot of overlaps, but they are also different in their starting points. And I think it helps address that question.
That's a good analogy. And, that actually cleared it up for me.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that too. That's a really great way of looking at it.
Great. And maybe Marina will let us know whether she agrees and whether she thinks that addresses the question. So with that said, let's talk about UDL. What did you think about the readings?
Well, I actually liked the reading and I related to it a lot. How they said how the curriculum is set, and if you were a student that didn't, particularly fall along the line with the curriculum, you were labeled with a disability. There's something wrong with you. And how they mentioned ramen in the article. And if you didn't have the specialized Rubik's Cube, he would have been labeled as having a disability. But because, the context was fixed for him, he's now a brilliant genius. He had more resources to produce what he knows. So I related to that a lot, especially when I was in school. I didn't quite fit in the curriculum. I didn't learn, I went through most of my school life thinking I'm stupid, to be honest with you. But, as I got older, it was I just understood things in different contexts than what was being taught to me.
I went to school in the 90s as well, and we did have different tracks in high school. We had the Regents track, the non-Regents track, and the more of a conceptual degree, whereas more life skills. I mean, students, no matter what class or what track you're in, they're still going to know their own labels. But I think now everyone's more sensitive to that, and it's not a disability more as it's just a challenge in a certain area. And I see this in music because they come from me from all over the school. It's not, I have kids from the life skills class. I have kids that are, number one in their class. But in my classroom, it's great because they're all on an even playing field because not everyone has the same ability, especially musically. Like, for example, I have one student who is pretty low functioning, but she's a killer violinist. And she just found her thing. And I think it's a great place when you have a situation in an environment where there's nothing wrong with being different and learning differently. And the only thing, as I find, is it's challenging for the teacher because I don't know if we've been given all the tools that we need to see our students successful. I think it's more trial and error. I mean, they give us professional development, but by the time we implement the professional development, they've moved on to another theory or another, concept that they think would be better. But yeah, I think it's better that everybody's in one class and it makes you feel better. I know my own daughter was in special education for the first 2 years, but she was in an inclusion class, but she was still with everybody else, and she thrived from it because she was able to model other students in areas that she was weak, and vice versa. She was able to, do the same thing for others. So I think the reading was great of explaining that and said some great points.
So Kelly, on the outline, you have a question about something mentioned early in chapter 4 about learning sciences. What is the question?
So the learning scientist asked, it said that learning is fairly predictable, and I'm kind of unclear how. I'm not sure if they mean by it's predictable by the different regions of the brain that's being affected. I don't know what they mean by the predictability.
So it helps to know that this reading comes from the same reading that we had a few weeks ago on the brain. I think the chapter was called The Variability of Learners. And so in that chapter, they talked about how learners are all different and variable, but that they are different in ways that are predictable. And so it's not just random and chaotic, that although there are differences in people based on what we know about the brain, these differences are still predictable. And so that's what UDL is building on.
Okay. So there could be predictability in the differences on how people prefer to learn or what works best for certain people.
Yeah, and that's why I think, just going back to the analogy, the buffet works is because we know that these tools are effective. And so instead of trying to treat every single individual as completely unique, we can kind of offer these as tools or resources because we know what works and we know what is more effective. And that way we don't feel like we have to do everything from scratch.
I know it also mentioned in the reading that the novice would kind of go through a trial and error. Do you think like students will go through trial and error on what tools work for them? Or do you think they kind of have a sense of what they know works for them?
You're asking whether novice learners will know what works for them or not, or do they have to do like trial and error? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
I feel like if students are given those options and tools and know how to use them, I think they'd be able to find what works for them. But again, it depends on if it's math, science, English. Maybe they're great writers, but terrible mathematicians. So if teachers give them the tools to say, listen, this is where you've been kind of having difficulties with, why don't you try it this way? I think students they would want to do it because they want to be successful. But if they're not given those tools, if they're not explained to them, I don't know if they would do it on their own or not. I don't know if they would know what to do on their own.
Because I at least know for me, when I was like first learning, like going to school, I did do kind of a trial and error, would pay attention. Okay, this works for this person. Let me try it. Okay, that didn't really work for me. Let's see what this person who's getting A's is doing. Let me try it. Okay, this kind of works.
I think that's part of what UDL is for, is that regardless of whether you're talking about a novice learner or a novice to a topic, the UDL guidelines recommend that teachers help students do more self-monitoring and be more self-aware so that they're not on their own doing trial and error, but also that they know what tools and resources are available for them to become more expert learners, I guess.
Because I think experts were once novices, no?
Sure, yeah. So I hope that answers your question. And now let's talk about the UDL guidelines. In chapter 4, it's divided into 3 tables. And I was wondering, what do you consider to be the most important?
Well, I thought that was a hard question to answer because I feel they're all important, and just kind of picking one goes against the whole brain idea that we're trying to implement.
So no, I should just clarify. When I say what is the most important, I think you're right. They are all important. I guess what I was getting at is that if you look at the entire list, so it's, I think in somewhere in the chapter they say that these are guidelines, so these are not rules. You don't have to do every single one of these. And so when I ask like what is the most important, it would be, how would you prioritize it? Maybe it's a better way of phrasing the question. Like if you had a lesson or unit, what would you start with? Just because it is very overwhelming to make sure you hit on every one of these. So what would your priority be?
So since you put it that way, I would definitely start with engagement. You gotta draw them in. If you're not engaged and you don't like something, because they also mentioned that in page 101, I believe. If you don't like it and you have a terrible mood towards what you're doing, it's just, you're not going to get to the rest. It's just not happening. So definitely engagement to start off. I would prioritize that 100% and just provide the options, so every student could pick what engages them and the options for self-regulation, because it's important they regulate themselves and they have that meta-reflection towards their own learning.
Based off the way you asked the question now, I think for me, for music, it would be representation, because you would need, right there it says the, understanding across languages, and music is a language and you have to be able to decode it and know what it is. I mean, I don't know if all music teachers would agree with me, but I think this very close second would be the engagement. And I work on that a lot with my students, which is, the self-assessment and reflection. They need to be able to go home and hear what they're playing and say, is this right? Is it not? What do I need to do? So I think the representation for me wins out as number one, but engagement follows very close second.
Kelly, you had an interesting question about flexibility and the limitations of that. Would you want to ask that question?
Oh, flexibility is a common theme. And can flexibility really be flexible for all students? And are there limitations to this? And I know Candice also asked a question about, low budget schools. Mm-hmm. Is this really realistic to put into every environment? Especially when I know my school district, they're on the low socioeconomic list. And since we were on the topic of engagement, I have some kids, students in class, no matter what you do, they're not going to be engaged because they have something else going on at home. Or a lot of these kids didn't eat breakfast. They get dinner at their school sometimes. How do you go around that? How flexible can you really be?
That's an interesting question. And for me, it sounds like there are at least 2 parts of this. So in terms of the real world context of students who are facing issues at home that they have to address, and whether UDL can overcome those issues. And then possibly there's a practical logistical side to using UDL and how restrictive that would be for the teacher. And I think I was wondering, Candice, do you want to address this first?
When I wrote one of my questions about the difference between Common Core instruction and UDL, it's interesting to hear the UDL because I'm not a math English. I don't do what they do, but they have modules that they have to follow down to the written word. They have to say exactly what they have to say to the kids. So if you have a kid that's, for whatever they need, it more has a question or doesn't have an understanding, and you can think of as a teacher another way around that, but that's not in your curriculum. Is that being flexible? Can you be flexible? And I think it depends on where you're teaching, what the support system is from administration, and the curriculum that's been adopted. Whereas some schools, like the school district that my kids are in, that would be absolutely there, as flexible as they can be to get every student where they need to be. Whereas my students, who are also coming from a socioeconomic background that's not really great for some of them. They're just pushing test scores for them. So it doesn't matter if they're learning, if they're not learning, they're not being flexible because they're not allowed to be flexible because they have to make sure this test that gets up to a certain point so they can keep their funding. So I think it depends on individual schools if you can be flexible or not.
Yeah, it's interesting you said about the test scores because the schools that are low socioeconomic, that's all they really have to show, to get the funding, like you said. And it's just tough because, they're not really learning or they're not having that engagement. It's just to the test.
They're very smart and crafty and they do understand all this. And my heart breaks for them because they know next town over, they're not doing this, so why them?
Well, I know in doing an independent study at Oceanside, they get to, do lots more flexible stuff. They don't have to, a lot of their parents opt out of the testing. And they get to do more hands-on, and they get to, it does break my heart.
One of the chapters end with something on UDL and Common Core. My own personal take is that UDL does not and should not conflict with Common Core, because Common Core is just a framework, a set of guidelines and standards that you aim for. And UDL is how you get there. It's not an either or. It's not like either you do UDL or you do Common Core. They're not fighting against each other. Obviously, there are some schools that may be more restrictive and more particular about how these standards are done. And it is a shame if those are very restrictive. But otherwise, UDL shouldn't be seen as something that you have to do in addition. It should be something that helps you get students to where they need to be with a Common Core.
Well, that's a good thought, honestly, because it did mention also in this reading that how goals can be implemented in the standards with the Common Core, how it's not so much focusing on a means, but just the way to get to the goal without the means.
As I was reading the chapter, my takeaway is that UDL emphasizes giving students multiple ways of accessing information, right? So not just giving them something to read, but maybe audio and video options. And it also recommends giving students multiple ways of demonstrating understanding, so letting them do a video instead of writing a paper. So while I fully agree with UDL and rely on my course design, so that's why you do forum, you do VoiceThread, the podcast is part of that as well. I often struggle with striking a balance. Because how do you make sure, for example, that students know how to read and write an academic article? So how do you think educators should strike that balance?
Well, I do agree. Although UDL is great to implement, you can't ignore other modes of expression, such as the writing and the reading. Because I know, like me, if I don't gotta write, just like how they mentioned Mason, he had a difficult time spelling and communicating through written words. If I'm not required to do it, I'm going to totally not do it. But because I'm totally not required to do it, that skill is going to be lacking. I graduated with my BS in biology, and we have to write a lot of scientific research papers. So I struggled with that, and I think it comes down to motivation. Why do I have to write? I have to write because it's good to know. I have to write scientific papers. I think it goes back to that motivation, given that why, instead of like, well, I want you to just do this and this, but it's like, if I can express myself this way, why do I have to do it this way? And just giving a reason why you gotta do it this way too, and why it's important. So my motivation to go to the writing center and to write correctly was, I either fail, or I do the writing. So I think the biggest thing is motivation. That's how you strike the balance. And just tell students, it's great that you can all express yourself in these different ways, but, you can't lack in the other area.
What I thought was a mini lesson on the subject area, or for example, on the academic articles. These are the important steps you need to take. You need to understand what the author's purpose. You have to know what are the arguments and, what you feel about what's the argument, if you agree, disagree. But that's only good for people that learn in that way. I'm more of a visual learner. I'm not really, I can read something and really understand it. I need to look at the whole picture. So that's why doing the mini lesson and then setting up stations of different types of way you learn. And, some people like to work in groups. So maybe one of the stations would be, all right, get together with a bunch of people and bounce ideas off of each other. Or some people need to watch videos or play a game or whatever, other they could think of, and then come back and see if they've learned. Also maybe giving, making kids do what they're not comfortable, because they do need to learn this. So it's yes, we're supposed to support the way they're best learning, but you can't also let them struggle in the ways that they're not and not face it and try to gain knowledge on how to do it that way. They're not going to want to, but it's important to push them to do that as well.
It also goes against, the real world. Sometimes it's like tough cookie. In the reality, you might have to do something asked of you that's not optimal to the way you do it. So I think it's also beneficial to be made uncomfortable and be like, hey, you're writing today. I know you're not the best writer, but
you're not going to get better unless you keep practicing at it.
That's it.
Yeah.
I had a similar question, which is, just like you said, can a case be made that you can go too far with UDL, that students need to know how to adapt? Because when they're in the workplace, if things are presented to them as a text or in text-centric ways, which is kind of like the critique of the reading, that if you're working somewhere, they're not going to give you something in visual and text and audio format. They're going to ask you have to read this thing, you have to read this report and analyze it. So if you provide too much flexibility in school, do you then not allow them to develop those skills? Whenever I ask myself these questions, I need to be careful, because then I want to avoid making excuses for myself for not providing those options.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's for me, that's always the struggle.
Your struggle for you is providing all the options, you mean?
Yeah.
Or kind of forcing students, for lack of better words?
Yeah. So like for this class and for just higher education in general, it's a lot easier to find readings and chapters that focus on the topic. I do want to try to make more videos like the SAMR model, the Bloom's taxonomy, or videos for other classes. It's a lot time consuming on my part to do that, but that's not the reason. It's just that I need to prioritize, and I do plan on adding more videos. Also, just more specifically about how I let students express.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to rely too much on written assignments.
Limit them, yeah.
So, for example, the hands-on assignment, I just changed it so that you can do a video as well. And I think that's okay, because I think for the hands-on, I don't need to read a paper. And in many ways, a paper might not even be the best way to showcase that. But there are definitely assignments where I feel like it should be written. And also, I do think the written part is important, because otherwise there may only be one class or two classes where students are really asked to write something. I feel like writing is such an important skill that is often left out because people don't really want to teach writing, or don't know how to teach writing, and also because for good intentions for to do UDL, they want students to be able to express themselves in different ways. But the result is that students often don't know how to write well.
I think in higher education, I think you should have a lot more of the writing and reading and doing research. And it's not my favorite thing to do, but because one of my other degrees was pretty much all we did was write papers, I got a lot better at it, and therefore now I can help my students with proofing and editing and explaining why things need to be done this way. And down the line, you're going to need to do this in high school and in college. And it's a really scary thing that I'm reading these seniors or even college freshmen papers, and they're not literate. They're just using text language. They don't understand to form sentences and like a topic sentence. But I mean, yes, it would be great to have more in higher education, more ways to do a project. I mean, because you kind of do need that, because when you're teaching, you can't just do writing. It's not going to be beneficial. So it'd be nice to learn, a few different ways to do a specific subject matter or this topic. Yes, there's reading and research on it, but you can also add a different element to it. But I think in the higher levels, you definitely need to do a lot of writing.
If you know you're a weak writer, I know I'm a weak writer. I'm not the most articulate either, but I go to the writing center.
That's great that you do that. Unfortunately, not enough students do. They're embarrassed to go, and which shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's what they're there for, you know.
But when it comes to UDL going too far, maybe it does. Maybe it's giving too many options. Maybe, we're not setting them up for success later on down the line. The big thing now is college career ready. So are we preparing our students in college career ready by the methods we're using now? I don't know. I guess time will tell.
That, what you said about providing too many options, that leads me to one question I have about the online course, which is providing too many options for expression. So like, for example, in the online class, you have voice thread and you can respond by audio. And there's actually also a text option. And I haven't enabled that because what I usually find is that, from my view, it fractures the experience, so that instead of having everyone talking and listening to each other, you suddenly have a piece of text in the middle of the conversation. Maybe people might prefer writing over speaking, but I think people prefer listening over reading. And so a lot of the people who write their responses get neglected. And I also feel like it creates a strangely ununified experience. Just for the online class, I was wondering, since you are taking the online class, what thoughts you have?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when I was reading in chapter 6, it talks about how the quiet student who doesn't typically take leadership roles might be more inclined to in a blog. But then again, this person who's so quiet should learn to have a voice in real life situations. So if you allow them to do it in a blog, it is kind of like a cop-out. I do think if you let everyone type, everyone would type. I think, it would be kind of a cop-out if you gave them the texting, the written part. Like if you have the quiet kids in class and you just kind of want them to have a voice and you just, okay, well, you can just write a little blog. You're really setting them up to be not heard the rest of their life, because they're not always, like I was talking about, they're not always going to be able to express themselves that way in the real world.
I think it's really important to get people out of their comfort zone. For me, speaking, on the voice threads and even just this is really out of my comfort zone. I'm more quiet, introverted. I have opinions, but, I'm more afraid of what if it's a stupid answer? What if, it's not exactly what I was supposed to be doing? So you kind of revert back and, you listen, you see what's going on. But now that we're not in a classroom setting, I'm forced to speak. I'm forced to make a voice thread. Whereas in some of my other classes, I just got away with saying my one thing for the class, put my hand back down and just listen to what was going on. I mean, it wasn't that I wasn't learning. I just don't want to talk.
I want to pivot to something else in the reading, chapter 6, on page 134. They write that goals must be written in ways that challenge all learners appropriately. How would you do that in your class?
Well, just like in the reading, I think it requires a balance between being undercutting and overcutting students. So I would do this by having constant assessment of the learners, where everyone is engaged cognitively. I would assess them by talking to them and observing them, and then tweak the goals according to how they're doing. I would pay attention to what's motivating and what strategies they're using that's helping them. And I would make sure the goals are very clear and we're all on the same page. And I would just provide them, with the buffet of resources they would need to accomplish the goal.
For me, this is kind of a strong suit because at any given time, I can have 120 students with instruments sitting in front of me waiting for assessment. So you get better at it. You get a bag of tricks of what works for certain situations and for certain types of students, and you just keep using them and it gets easier. But a bonus for me is I also, not only do I get them in a large group setting, that I also get them sometimes one-on-one or, 4 or 5 kids at one time, and where I could really sit down, learn their personalities, get them comfortable. And from there, I can assess just from a few things. I'm like, oh, okay, I know what your problem is. It's a posture issue. All right, we'll fix this. Oh, it's a reading issue. But in my own head, I have goals for all my kids. And I share it with the students, and they agree most of the time. But you always kind of have to guide them back on. because they want the easy way out. They don't want to be challenged. They just want to come in my class and not have to think for 46 minutes. But, I'm like, not in this class, not today. So, it's a hard skill to adapt right away. It takes years of practice to understand each learner and what works for them. And sometimes you get a kid who's completely different than you've ever taught before, which I'm actually finding. This is I'm teaching 16 years. So this is the first year that I've had difficulty. Now, I don't know if it's because of Common Core. I don't know if it's home situations. I don't know if it's technology. I don't really know why, but I have a hard time every day trying to fix and do goals and assess. So, it's like learning all over again for me. So I can understand their frustrations and their struggles because I'm having struggles just with them.
They might make a really interesting action research project to figure out why that is for this group of students.
Yeah.
Now, both of you are in K-12, right?
Yes. Oh, I am.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe you can help me with this then, because this is about the next question. Given how much work it takes to properly make a lesson or unit comply with UDL principles, do you think educators will be less likely to make changes to the curriculum? So I'm in higher ed, so I'm thinking more along those lines. So in K-12, I assume that there would be topics that would always be taught, like addition, subtraction, geometry, American Revolution. I think these are topics that are standard. But for me, and especially in my field of educational technology, I need to keep the material fresh. So I feel like it would be a lot harder, or I would be a lot more reluctant to adjust my teaching material if for every reading I need to provide different supports. And so it's not an excuse. I do try to provide videos, as I said earlier, when it's appropriate. And I know I can do a lot better, but sometimes I'm limited by what I can provide for practical reasons. So what I don't want to happen is that because I've set up all these different options and that I just stop changing my curriculum because of that. And I was wondering what do you think of that?
In terms of keeping it fresh, yes, it would be hard to. I'm just going to say for me, like I try to keep everyone engaged, so I pay attention to what they're into. So my school is heavily Latina, and they all like to do something called nay-naying. It's like a dance. So when and I let them put their music on and nay-nay, only when they've completed a task. And I'm very entertaining as a teacher. So I'm like, okay, you did this right, you may nay-nay. So it kind of keeps everyone engaged and they want to, do the standard way of, how you said, doing it. Because they want to get up and nay-nay, or I make it funny. I'm not changing anything. I'm not providing different supports of anything. I'm just being funny and entertaining with it and engaging everyone.
I think you really need to be creative and innovative to keep your lessons from being dull and not motivating. I feel like a teacher is a lifelong student, so we're still learning and the game keeps getting changed on us. So, we have to stay with it and get, the new techniques. And, there's so many great ways now than there was when I first started teaching. Now we have all these websites, all these blogs, all these sites that you can go to. And this is what this person's doing and it's working and this one's not working. So it's always networking and always talking and always asking questions. I think that's the best way to keep things fresh. Once you lose that and you don't have any way to relate to the students, you're done for. I see that with the teachers, they're in there 40 years, 35 years, 40 years, and, you see them going downhill, which previously that they were the best teachers. They were the ones all the students loved, but they just stopped learning. They stopped networking, and it causes a problem.
And it goes back to relating with the students also, like you said, you got to pay attention to the culture or the climate.
Yeah, I guess I feel kind of like what we were talking about this in this past week about kind of the fear of change in some teachers. This can relate to technology. This can be related to a particular teaching philosophy. We touch on a few. And if you have a structure in place, then it's a lot harder to change after that because you have to redo a lot of things. In your responses, some of you said that they were kind of fearing change. I think that's part of that, but also feel like having too much of a structure could make people baked into their methods. And I feel like UDL can be like that sometimes. If for every reading I created video and audio and whatever, every time I'm going to swap out a reading, I'm going to be thinking, okay, I'm going to have to redo all this stuff again. And would that make me less likely to want to do that? I hope that's not the case, but sometimes I do worry about that.
Well, I think it's a valid worry. Teachers have to do so much already. And then, like you said, if you have to change everything around, you're a person too. It takes time to, you can do stuff like implement the videos and, but when you have to do a whole 360, and I worry about that also. I have the same concerns as you.
So Kelly, you had one final question relating UDL to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Do you want to ask that?
You know how we talked about UDL and, they want to have an optimal environment and having all these resources and getting kids engaged and monitor their own learning. But if some kids, if they're worried about other things at home, like, what they're going to eat, or maybe they have a family dysfunction, how do you work around that and get them to be engaged in their learning and have this metacognition?
I live this every day. Just a side story really quick. We have a new teacher in our department, and the day or two before a break, the kids are absolutely insane. They're just not behaved well. They're constantly getting into fights. And she's like, I just don't understand what is going on. I said, it's because many of these students are going home. They know they're not going to eat for the week because their only meals were here at school. They know nobody's home for them. And particularly over the Christmas break, they didn't come in the day after the break because they didn't want to hear how other students got so many things for Christmas and they got nothing. So I think it affects them a lot. I think a lot of them just fall into that whole routine. Well, you know what? Nothing's going for me. Why do I bother with school? School's not getting me fed. School's not getting me what I need. So why should I bother? But as a teacher, you somehow have to figure out how to get to them. No, it doesn't have to be this way your whole life. You just kind of need to take them under take them under your wing. I have 2 kids at home, but I have about 1,000 other kids that always are with me. They come to me at lunch, they come to me after school, before school, and I let them in. They feel safe and comfortable. And you know what? They learn more because they're like, I can do this. Yeah. There's a future for me. It will help. But if you don't have that support system at school, I think you're setting up for failure for a lot, not just school-wise, it's just social, emotional.
And it's hard you address that and then expect them to do UDL and explore their options.
Exactly.
Be meta-reflective.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, they instituted a program in my school about 5 years ago now. We do meditation. So every morning, right after homeroom, we do 8 minutes of meditative breathing. A student will come on the announcements, or the lights are off. I put on like soothing meditation music in the background. We all sit in the chairs. They go through how to breathe and what different ways to breathe. The kids actually use it. I did a project a couple of years ago on do you like the breathing? Have you used the breathing? And it was overwhelmingly yes. They really loved it. They won't tell their friends that, but it does help. So, I mean, I know some schools are starting to try to help with things like the social emotional learning, the breathing, the breakfast and, programs. So it is a big deal, I think, that they don't feel safe in their own environment. So they're not going to learn. There's no way.
Candice, I think you should take the professor's advice and do a research paper. It would be interesting.
Well, we do have a research class, so down the line.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I think UDL, the idea of UDL, though, is that where traditionally the burden of trying to understand and overcoming these barriers are on the students. The idea of UDL is to shift it more to the teachers so that the teachers provide the different options. So hopefully that will help reduce the anxiety and the at least any anxiety that comes with the learning part of it. In terms of anything at home, that's obviously going to affect how they perform in class as well. I guess is harder for the teacher to control, but it's good to know. Like I think in the podcast with Jonathan and Jennifer, Jonathan had mentioned that he has homeroom and he would understand. He would know the students background? Do they sleep? Knowing that if they didn't sleep well, they're not going to be able to learn because sleep is important to the brain and all that stuff. So yeah, it would impact it. And again, hopefully UDL is to help reduce any barriers that you can as a teacher.
UDL kind of reminded me of like a Montessori school when I was reading it, in a way, because Montessori schools foster a lot of discovery learning and like independence and metacognition.
Well, thank you for coming here and talking about UDL with us. I feel like we critiqued it a lot more than we embraced it.
Yeah.
But maybe that's just a reflection of my own personal struggle, even though I don't disagree with it. And I like it and I use it a lot. I think sometimes it's hard to strike that balance. It's something that I'm still trying to figure out.
I think the critiquing comes from just us thinking about it rather than bashing it.
Yes, for me it is.
It's the nature of what we do every day. We critique every day.
Right, yeah. And you don't want to embrace anything blindly. So, well, I guess that wraps up this episode of The Conversation. We're off next week due to spring break, but when we come back, we'll be talking about standards and needs. Thank you, Kelly and Candice, for coming on this episode.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Have a great spring break, and I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thank you.